Welcome to Syntax. On this Monday Hasty Treat, we're going to be talking about why your CSS sucks. That's right. We're going to be going through some of the reasons why you might be writing bad CSS and what you can do about that to change that. So that way you can write well-maintainable, nicely readable, and then CSS that's going to make your coworkers happy. As always, my name is Scott Tolinsky. I'm a developer from Denver. With me, as always, is Wes Boss. What's up, Wes?
Hey, as someone who writes a lot of sucky CSS, I feel like I have a lot to bring to this conversation.
Love it. Love it. Hey, I don't know if you saw this, Wes, but Canada won the gold for men's breaking, or also known as breakdancing in the Olympics. Yes, Canada. Phil Wizard, who was, he's a kind of a favorite to win. He hasn't ever won a world championship before, but he's been close. So him winning is not a shocking surprise, but I thought you might like to know that.
Wow. Oh, that's cool. I didn't even realize. Can we talk about all the drama that went down with the Australian woman?
Gosh.
I know that it's
I'm so tired. Yes. Yeah.
It's currently progressing. You know, people are thinking that she like scammed her way in. But all of that aside, thoughts on the Australian, and can you explain what happened?
Yeah. So, okay, for one, breaking is oftentimes goofy. You know, it goes back into the history. Frosty Freeze, one of the original Rocksteady, maybe not first gen. He might be first gen. Either way, old school Rocksteady crew breaker, very goofy style. Now he's a legend of the game and everything like that. So he's not ray gun, but it can be goofy and it can be weird. I've seen more weird dancing than I saw from her at the Olympics. That is does not scratch the surface of weird dancing and breaking. That said, Australia was given 2 spots, one for the men's and one for the women's, and they won those spots fair and square in their qualifiers. It just so happens that the skill level in Australia is different. So when people saw those video clips, that's a qualifier. So she was doing that in a qualifying round, and what sucks about it is they ignored all of the other incredible, like the general public. You know, I think it's starting to see a little bit opposite of that now, but people were ignoring all the crazy stuff that people did and just focused on this one weird kind of set. So one, in the breaking community, even if somebody is not doing well in a battle, their punishment for that is they don't get to move on. But you typically, if I was battling somebody and they were bad, you'd still be kind of clapping for them and say, yeah, good job. And then you go and smoke them and then they're gone. Right. So, so the outside opinions of people just being so harping on this poor person, it's that's not what we're about, you know?
But I understand all that, but there's not much I say, I could do that. You watch the Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
I'm pretty sure I could do.
Oh, yeah.
I could do that.
Totally.
And she's the best, the absolute best in all of Australia. You're telling me?
You know what?
You're telling me there's no one better?
For the ladies, it's tough with B girls and women's breaking.
I saw people on TikTok just replicate the entire session.
No. It's a combination of a few things. You know, in breaking, you can get a lot further in competitions just being musical, even if you're not doing anything cool. So that gives people who can dance to the music a better advantage in competitions like that. So theoretically, she could win a competition just by being on the music, rather than doing crazy cool things. And women's breaking especially has only seen an uptick in people doing the power moves or the spins or the tricks. And I don't know, women have been doing head spins for a long time, but things like the air flares and the flares, those are brand new inside of women's breaking in the last 4 years, 3 years-ish. So yeah, there is a chance she is the best women's breakdancer, breaking, B-girl in Australia. There is a chance of that. So I don't know. The scene there is even the men's competitor, that B-boy, he was fine, but he was also not at the same level as everyone else, and he was out very quickly. So yeah, I think it's just a matter of a perfect storm. And
you think a country that's upside down would be pretty good at breakdancing, but no.
I actually got breaking shoes from Nike. They made the first ever breaking shoes for the Olympics, and the swoosh is upside down on them, and I thought that was pretty great.
Oh, that's great, man. Well, I very, very, very thoroughly enjoyed all the memes coming out
Oh
of that.
God, I don't.
I would not.
Yes.
The poor girl is probably feeling absolutely awful right now. But I loved all the memes where people are like, my toddler at 3 a.m. and
Oh
it's just
my
like,
God. As the moderator of the B-Boy subreddit, I did not like the memes because people are just flooding the stupid subreddit with those memes. I've had to ban people left and right. So, oh,
oh, well,
all right,
that's
banter.
great. Let's talk about coding for
Yes.
a bit.
Oh, but before we get into it, if your code sucks, you'll want to use something like Sentry to make sure that you have your errors. That way you can solve them. So head on over to sentry.io/syntax. Sign up and get 2 months for free. Again, if your code sucks or even if it doesn't, you'll want something to let you know it sucks. All right. CSS. I think we've all experienced working in maybe legacy CSS or somebody else's CSS. There's sometimes, I want to contribute to projects. I have a really hard time with this, Wes. If I'm using like an open source tool that exists, for instance, there's a guy doing an open source hockey contracts tool. Like the tool that showed all the contracts and the salary cap just got acquired by one of the hockey teams. So somebody's making an open source one. And I wanted to contribute to that. And gosh darn, the project has only existed for like a year and the CSS is horrific. And I don't like, I have a hard time not wanting to go in there, just deleting it all and trying to help them. But a lot of these things that we're going to be talking about in this episode are things that I've personally experienced in other people's code bases, or maybe even previous Scott, or maybe even current Scott has authored things this way. And it definitely can cause issues down the line. It can cause maintainability problems. It can be frustrating to work in for a lot of reasons. So we're just going to be listing off a few things that could be the reason why your CSS is hard to work in. So, number one, you're styling the wrong element. This is something I see all the time, especially with people who don't write CSS very often. Let's say you have, here's a one, like a pagination, right? You have a pagination that's a bar full of buttons.
Yeah.
And somebody would say, okay, this is an unordered list, right? So then they give the unordered list like a height of 100 pixels. I know that's an outrageous value, but let's say they do that. Then they do their LIs, they, put a display flex on them, or even worse, they float them or something, and something is not filling the height correctly. So what do? They maybe throw that height 100 on the list item, and then maybe the height 100 on the anchor tag. And next thing you know, you have a giant mess of things where if you go to change the parent, the children are still popping out. And I see this all the time where people, they style the wrong thing. They give the wrong thing the height. They give the wrong thing the display block or whatever. And then therefore, they have to do that again up a level or down a level. And they keep doing that until it looks the way they want it to. So how do you fix styling the wrong element? I think it's really just, one, it's experience and knowing what to style. But two, if you do notice that start to happen, like, hey, I put a height 100 on this thing and the child is not getting that height. So then if you notice yourself doing that, stop right away and remove it from the parent and put it on the child, because the parent typically will adjust, unless it has a hard-coded value, to fit the child. But if the child is big, then the parent will have to grow, unless, of course, it is explicitly given a size, which means, you have some issues.
When I taught, I would always say this thing, which is embrace the flex, or embrace fluidity in CSS, meaning that do not hard code widths and heights on too many things. Allow the content to define the size of it. You can certainly put max widths and min widths and flex values and padding and margin on everything. However, as soon as you give something a hard value, you're sort of closing the door for other situations to come up, and that's going to end in a world of pain. I see it all the time. Even if you look at like Chrome DevTools, you inspect the CSS on there, there's so much stuff in Chrome DevTools that has a hard width and height on it. And then as they're trying to make DevTools a little bit more fluid and be able to scale up and down, I've noticed over the years they've had to take a lot of that out because it's just too rigid. Let the content speak for itself.
Yeah, it is. It is funny, and this can also even happen beyond sizes. It can also happen with like I see this a lot of times with background colors too, where like somebody will throw a background color on the nav and the header and the body, and those colors are all the same thing when they don't need to be. Right? Don't worry about putting a background color on something that's deeply nested if its parent has that same background color. That's just going to cause a ton of problems down the line if you want to change things at any given point.
Yeah, you find yourself it not being flexible enough. You find yourself having to overwrite that in the future. Whereas if you simply just left it off, or if you simply made a stripped down version first, then you can go in and add on top if you actually need that in the future.
Yeah, so this is a tough one because some of it is just feel and you get used to these sort of things.
Yeah.
But if you notice yourself setting a value on too many things or having to override or constantly having to increase how many properties you're adding on things just to get it to look the way you are, chances are you're styling the wrong thing and you need to either take a step back or take a step forward into what you're styling specifically.
Next one here is you're nesting too deep. It kind of comes along with what we just said is that if your selectors are so deeply nested inside of each other, you're going to find that your styles are a little bit too rigid and it's much harder to overwrite. And your components are not as reusable because you're assuming that this button is inside of card, inside of a pop-up, whereas you should really be thinking, how can I apply the styles to this element as directly as possible so that it doesn't assume that this element will live inside of another parent. So I have hit this one so many times in my career. Even my own website right now is in style components, and I'm just dipping into figuring out I'm moving that to Panda CSS, which they have an API that will change it. It will, like, I don't want to rewrite my CSS at all. I just want to keep the styled API, but I want to use the Panda to generate the utility classes for me. And like I use not a lot, but a fair amount of nesting inside of my components. And the resultant CSS and HTML is not great. And I'm realizing, okay, maybe I shouldn't have nested that so deeply. Maybe I should have busted that out into its own component. Which I can do. Yeah. I tend to not bust things out as fast as possible until I explicitly need to.
Yeah, I get that. And even to go along with that nesting too deep is to understand specificity in a way that like you only want to be as specific as you need to be when applying styles to something. And scoped styles can help with that because they're very specifically stuck onto an element, right? If you're scoping really tightly. But you want to be able to understand the impact of how many different selectors or things like that you are adding into a chain of things to select a specific item, and things like important, right? Important is the classic number one CSS code smell. Important is pretty much typically used for overriding CSS that you cannot access. And that's it. If you find yourself using important to overwrite your own CSS, it is a major cause for concern that your specificity is kind of out of whack in terms of what you're trying to access. So obviously that's a code smell, but being able to understand, classes versus nested classes versus IDs versus important versus, element selectors directly. What does that specificity order look like and how is that impacting your CSS? Just having a basic understanding of that stuff will take you quite a bit.
And realizing when you understand what makes something more specific and trying to stay away from it, because if everything is just a class or if everything is nested 1 or 2 levels deep, then you're not going to run into too many issues where you're sort of battling. This is the word I can never say. Specificity. Specificity?
Yeah, that's your classic. As bad as you are saying it, I'm bad as typing it because I could not spell specificity this morning. I was like typing. I was like, I can say it, but I can't type it.
Specificity. I think I did it. Specificity.
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 Yeah.
I'm healed.
Yeah, you're healed.
Nice. All right, until next time.
Yes.
Next one we have here is your classes don't use a system. So we did a show, episode 807, syntax.fm/807, on the different ways to sort of author your CSS and author your components. And there are many different ways to approach it, right? You can use Tailwind or Panda or Scope CSS or modules or variables and classes, and there's lots of different ways to do it. The important part is that you're not just sort of cowboying it, adding classes to random stuff as you need it, whereas you have a little bit of a system, a little bit of an approach to this type of thing.
Yes. Yeah, and that doesn't mean you need to use BEM or even anything that concrete of a system. But let's say you are using like a scoped CSS system or even like your utility-based CSS system or any of this stuff, and you need to add a class. It's important to know just the general way in which that class should exist, because somebody could go in and add a class that is using BEM, and somebody could just go and add a straight up class, and somebody could use it as a single word class and stuff like that. So even if you aren't building your entire CSS based on like a CSS class system, it's still important to have a general style in which you're adhering to the way you have your class names. I just think that's important, and therefore everybody will kind of know what they're doing. Another big one here is using values instead of CSS variables. And this is for all kinds of things, whether that's font sizes, colors, tons of things are important to set once and then use the variable, because you can have situations where all of a sudden you're adding bespoke font sizes because this font looks nice, or this font size looks nice, and the next thing you know, you're not working within a system at all. You're working off of it looks nice. And that can be okay in small projects, but the larger your project gets, the harder and harder that will be to maintain over time. If your system does not include the size that you need for your fonts or the color that you need, you don't add it in a one-off case, you adjust the system. So you either add it as a systematized variable, or you tweak, maybe you have a font scale. Maybe you tweak that font scale to make the whole thing look better or more like what you're trying to accomplish. But again, especially with things like colors and font sizes, font families, those types of things, there's a massive amount of things where having a CSS variable is not just good for maintainability, but it's good for readability. It's good for consistency. And most of the time, you'll make refactoring easy if you ever need to refactor. There's so many benefits to it.
I always talk about how websites rot or websites drift. CSS sort of drifts, meaning that we have this color, and somebody used a color picker and it didn't get it bang on, so it's a couple hexes off, and and somebody wrote it in RGB, or someone used another color picker. And over time, these things start to look a little bit different from each other. And over the scope of a year or two on a large project, you've all of a sudden added a whole bunch of CSS that is very hard to maintain and is not as consistent across the board as you want. That's why we have a lot of these design systems, which are very rigid. And a lot of times developers don't necessarily like them because you have to work within the confines of it, but it will stop that drift or that rot over time.
Yeah, which it's very real. I think we've all seen it. That thing about the color, using like a color picker and then just getting it ever so slightly different, man, that is too real. I've been in so many old code bases that have like, even 5 or 6 different, slightly different hex values, that it's like, if you were to just throw one of those in a variable, use that variable, it would solve you so many issues down the line.
I had that problem for many years where I use my yellow, and I have a keyboard shortcut for my yellow, and I just type :yellow and it auto-completes it. And I had to stop myself from using it because I realized this should be a variable, even though I know it's my yellow and I could do a find and replace because it will be the same thing every single time. Even if you want to theme it, you want to do a dark mode, it's much better to have just a single variable. And even then you go, like the syntax yellow, before we printed the skate decks for the syntax, I tweaked the yellow just a little bit. And
went brighter.
Right, a little bit brighter. It was a little bit too washed out. And I was glad that our website used variables because I was able to go into the website, click on the variable, and just drag the slider up and around a little bit until I go, that looks good. And then I was able to change that one value. It's so much easier to do that than to have to like find and replace every single value. And, I didn't get that one instance. Now we have yellow. We have the old yellow and the new yellow, pain in the butt.
Yeah. Another big one is understanding, or you don't understand block versus inline block. And therefore, you're either using HTML elements with the wrong default thing, and you're applying block, and then you're applying inline block. You don't understand, so you're just kind of throwing at the wall until it sticks. So having a good understanding of what inline and what block and inline block means inside of the context of the document flow will make you a much better CSS developer. Also, important now in that we have things like, padding inline or, margin block start instead of margin left, margin right. We're no longer thinking about left, right, top, bottom. We're thinking about inline and block in a top left, bottom right situation.
CSS logical properties, that's referred to if you want to look that up. We've referred to it many times over the years.
Yes.
Next one is you're not using the right tool for the job. This one's like, I guess, a little bit subjective because there's always more than one way to do the job. But you got Flexbox, you got grid, you have CSS columns, or even just like you're not using the right elements for the job as well. Are you using a link where it should be a button and vice versa? Are you putting a div where it should be a details dialog? Being able to understand what the landscape of tools are out there and keeping up to date with CSS changed a whole lot in the last 2 years. Do you know about all of those new things so that you can tackle them?
Yeah, and in regards to the Flex versus grid thing, I do think there are some people who learned Flexbox once and have just said, I can do most things with Flexbox.
Yeah.
But there are times when a grid is more than appropriate, so instead of learning grid and sitting down and using the right tool for the job, they're going to use Flexbox for something that is maybe a standardized XY, grid, and they're going to try to use Flexbox, and then next thing you know, you got flex shrink issues and all kinds of weird stuff because it's not necessarily the best tool for that job.
Let me ask you about Flexbox versus grid. When you're tackling something and it's seemingly Flexbox and grid can do it, what's your approach? Do you default to one over the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think about almost like if it's in one line, I'm almost always using Flexbox, where if it's everything staying on one plane, to me, that is one like axis. A default to Flexbox. But if it starts to get into two axes and I need control over it, that's a grid situation for me, almost 100% of the time. Not to say that you can't use Flexbox with wrap, but typically when you're doing that, it's when things are not standardized. And let's say you just have items that need to reshuffle and flow into the next line. Then I'm going to reach for Flexbox. But if I need it to be standardized, I need it to be a specific width or size or percentage, then I'm going to reach for grid almost 100% of the time.
Yeah, I will default to grid on absolutely everything, and then only go for Flexbox when the elements in the axis are different sizes and likely need to wrap. So if you have a big item and then two small ones and then a really big one, and then on the next line, the thing about grid is that every column needs to be the same width. Whereas Flexbox, every single row can have different sized columns. They're not even columns. The items are just flexing to how big they need to be.
I think the different size thing is an important distinction there, because in grid, yes, things can be fluid, but you typically have an understanding of some kind of standardized size. And with Flexbox, it's like, these things could be anything. Let me just shove a bunch of stuff into this area and it's going to adjust. Next one is you're setting the value in too many places, and this goes along with your styling the wrong element. If you notice that you're setting a value on several things to accomplish one thing, that is an issue. So that goes directly along with the styling the wrong element one.
All right, last one we have here is you're scoping too tightly or not tightly enough. And it's true. We talked about that in our components one, is sometimes you are scoping things too tightly, where if you want to be able to reuse a component in another spot, you're not able to sort of move it around. And then sometimes you're not doing it tightly enough where you apply some CSS to an element on the page and then, oops, that accidentally has leaked out, or that's accidentally styling some other parts on the page. So knowing where that sweet spot is, and again, this type of stuff, I think it just comes with experience.
Yeah, it comes with experience, but also you'll notice if you're constantly having to override things, or you find yourself writing the exact same CSS in multiple places, like you're inside of a component and you find yourself writing the exact same CSS you wrote inside of another file that's tightly scoped, then you're thinking, all right, maybe this needs to be a utility class or just a class itself, or maybe this should be a component even, and then it can be scoped to that component. There's a lot of different ways to solve this issue, but if you're scoping really tightly and you find yourself repeating yourself, that could be a problem.
Yeah, we always say dry code, don't repeat yourself. And like, I think it's fine, and you probably think this, it's fine to sometimes repeat yourself. Like sometimes it's way too much work to create this crazy abstraction because you want to reuse 12 lines of CSS in 2 different spots on the website. And sometimes it's fine just to copy paste the thing and edit both of them if you need to change. But in other cases, you find yourself, oh, I've duplicated this thing over and over again. Like, for example, on my westboss.com, I have this like grit texture that is in, I don't know, 50 different spots on the website. And I found myself going, oh, wow, I have applied this background color, background repeat, background size on like 6 or 7 different spots. So I stopped, I ripped it all out, and I made a utility class. I simply just pop grit on an item, and anywhere that I pop that on will get that effect.
Awesome. Yeah, totally. I think this is, again, one you'll get with practice, but like you said, there is an extent where repeating yourself is certainly appropriate. I think there's context in which you're worrying about a big site with a lot of people working on it, and then therefore dry code becomes more important rather than a medium to smaller size sites where it's less of an issue.
What's the acronym for sometimes repeat yourself? SRI code? Fry code?
SRI code.
A few times to repeat yourself is fine. Fry code.
A few times.
We gotta think. Tweet us at SyndexFM. What kind of rye code is? Well, maybe that is rye code where you repeat yourself a few times, but not too many. Don't drink too much rye. Don't 1 or 2 glasses of rye is fine, but too much, it's not a good day.
You're feeling it. Yeah. You're having some problems. All right, cool. Well, I think that's it. That's why your CSS sucks. If you have any other reasons why you think your CSS sucks, let me know. We can talk about those on the show, or we can maybe just, have a deeper understanding about why people's CSS sucks and what sucks about it. So thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.
Peace.
Peace.